Hi. So in this lecture, we'll start talking about the middle ear. Before we progress with the middle ear, let's quickly review some of the anatomical orientations. Um, so you've got superior with structures towards facing or towards the head, the inferior away from the head, anterior towards your nose, posterior to the back of your head. Medial is towards the midline. Lateral is away from the midline. Proximal is close to the midline. Distal away from the midline. And many of the figures you might look at them as a sagittal section or a mid-sagittal section where the body is divided into two exact halves. Okay, the middle ear lies in between, of course, the external ear and the inner ear. And it's mainly responsible for conducting the sound energy from the external ear and to the fluids in the inner ear. It's also known as the tympanic cavity. From an evolutionary biology point of view, the middle ear actually is considered a signature feature, anatomical feature, and it's believed to be what's made us able to um, listen to high-pitched sounds. Um, we do know that um, animals, I mean, fishes in the water um, do hear, and they do have an auditory system, but they're not as efficient as the mammalian auditory system is, essentially because they don't hear the high-pitched sounds well. Um, but the middle ear uh, apparently has made us able to hear those high-pitched sounds, and now we know that listening to the high-pitched sounds is important because that's what enables us to um, localize or detect the direction of a sound source. And again, in an evolutionary basis, and from a survival point of view, that was important. So the majority of the sounds that we encounter are traveling through the air medium. And that's not a problem when sound travels through our external ear. Uh, but ultimately, for us to hear that, that sound needs to be converted into a form that the human nervous system can understand. And that is done by the auditory transduction within the inner ear. We know that the inner ear is fluid filled. Um, so we've got the air filled external ear, and we've got a fluid filled inner ear where the sound needs to be well, conducted in whatever form that it can be can, can be converted by the auditory nerve um, and taken towards the brain for it to be interpreted. Now, the problem comes when the sound energy travels from an air medium into a more denser medium, like the fluid medium within the inner ear. You probably would have experienced this when you're underwater and how sound is muffled, and even if somebody's yelling at the top of the surface of the water. Uh, And that's because when energy travels from a less dense medium to a more denser medium, much of this is reflected back. Okay. Um, in terms of water, which is about 5 times more denser than air, almost about 90% of this energy is reflected back. Now, since the dB scale is a log scale, that kind of translates to about a 30 dB loss. Okay, so this loss of energy um, between when sound travels from a less denser medium to a denser medium is what we call as impedance mismatch. Now the middle ear's main role is to overcome this loss of energy because of this impedance mismatch to effectively conduct the sound from the external ear to the inner ear. Is something what we call as impedance um, mismatch, the loss of energy. Let's quickly review the anatomy of the middle ear. So the adult middle ear cavity is almost it's oval shaped, and it's about 2 centimeter cube in dimensions. The middle ear is enclosed, it's completely covered by this important bone of the skull known as the temporal bone. And the middle ear cavity is actually lined by this moist mucous membrane, which, just like the membrane on our nose, results in this mucous fluid that is periodically removed by our intact eustachian tube. Okay, and we're going to be talking about the eustachian tube in a bit. The middle ear cavity also encloses those 3 small bones that we call as ossicles that actually are connected from the lateral wall towards the medial wall. So the temporal bone is that bone that lies behind the ears, around the ears, and a part of the temporal bone is this mastoid process that just refers to that part of the bone just behind our pinna. And the mastoid part of the temporal bone, unlike much of the skull, is actually a porous bone. It's an air-filled bone. And there's a number of functions that's attributed to that. Because it's the lightest part of the skull, it's believed to make our head actually lighter than the size, enabling us the head to float, for example, when you're in water. But from an acoustical point of view, the mastoid air cells play an important role by improving the resonance of sound, so improving the resonance of our voice. But from a clinical point of view, actually the mastoid hair cells can be troublesome because now infection, if you're having a middle ear infection, resulting in a condition known as mastoiditis that we'll probably talk about when we talk about the disorders of the ear. So the middle ear or the tympanic cavity is separated from the external auditory meatus of the outer ear by this tympanic membrane. It's separated by separated from the inner ear by this oval window and round window, kind of the 2 windows that opens into the inner ear. And schematically, it's easier to study the middle ear cavity as a 6-sided cube. So it's got 6 sides. So if you've got the lateral side, a lateral wall over here, which would be, majority of that would be a tympanic membrane. In this illustration, the anterior wall is actually removed. So that's like the front wall, the side of your face, which has the side of the face. We've got the medial wall, which would be the wall that separates the middle ear from the inner ear. We've got the roof, which would be the top, and the floor at the base. And then opposite to the anterior wall, towards the mastoid air cell side, would be your posterior wall. And here you can see the tympanic membrane connected to the inner ear by this chain of ossicles, beginning with the malleus, then the incus, and then the stapes over here. So let's talk about each of those walls and some of the important anatomical landmarks in each of those walls. So you've got the anterior, also known as a carotid wall. It's got one of the important arteries supplying actually for the head, namely the internal carotid artery. It also has the regions of one of the 2 middle ear muscles, the larger of the 2 middle ear muscles, known as the tensor tympani. And it also has the origins of the eustachian tube. Okay, the eustachian tube or the auditory tube is a tube that connects the middle ear space to the nasopharynx. And we'll be talking about the eustachian tube in a bit. Opposite to the anterior wall is your posterior wall. It's the wall that separates the middle ear space from the mastoid process and the mastoid air cells. One of the important anatomical landmarks of this posterior wall is this pyramidal eminence, which is but a small spike, small bony spike, uh, from which the stapedius muscle, the second middle ear muscle, the smallest of the muscles, well, actually the smallest of the muscles in the human body, is connected to. So the stapedius muscle connects the posterior wall to the stapes ossicle, while the tensor tympani muscle connects the anterior wall to the malleus, the larger of the three ossicles. Then we've got the medial wall, also known as a labyrinthic wall. It's the wall that separates the middle ear from the inner ear. And some of the important landmarks in this medial wall is the oval window, to which the stapes is connected to. And below the oval window is your round window. Okay. There is a bony, almost like shell that separates the oval window and the round window, and it's known as a promontory. And the promontory is actually caused by the first turn of the cochlea. Okay. Towards the upper side of the labyrinthic wall or the medial wall is the prominence of the facial canal, which is actually kind of a duct through which the facial nerve, the seventh cranial nerve, traverses. Okay, here's a schematic illustration of the tympanica, the middle ear cavity, as a six-sided cube. So let's look at this figure first. So here, this is a view of that middle ear cavity with the anterior wall, the wall where well, the face is removed. And so here you can see the tympanic membrane, and in this end you're seeing the promontory. Okay, so to the tympanic membrane we've got the malleus connected to the incus, and the incus in turn connected to the stapes, which ends in the oval window at the top of the promontory. So here you're seeing the prominence of the facial canal through which the facial nerve traverses. In this illustration, you can also see the tensor tympani muscle, which actually originates from the anterior wall that's missing in this figure, while the stapes would be the one that's connected to the stapedius, pardon me, is the one that's connected to the stapes, and that originates from the posterior wall, the wall that's opposite over here. In this illustration, we've got the tympanic membrane removed, and that's a tympanic membrane, which would be a lateral wall, is removed. So if the tympanic membrane was to be there, would be somewhere like that. So that in turn is connected to the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, which are also removed in this illustration. So here would be your anterior wall, and that would be your posterior wall. So in the anterior wall, you're seeing the eustachian tube, and then you're seeing the origins of the tensor tympani muscle over here. In the posterior wall, you're seeing the pyramidal eminence, from which the stapedius muscle originates. So the medial wall, we have those two windows, oval window and the round window. The oval window is occupied actually by the base, the platform of the stapes, and it's kind of surrounded by a ring of bone, just like the tympanic membrane is surrounded by a ring of bone. The round window is situated below the oval window, and it's separated by this, as I said, this rounded bone known as a promontory. Okay. The round window is also known as a secondary tympanic membrane because it also has three layers just like the tympanic membrane does. And the main role of this round window is to dissipate pressure caused by the oval window moving in and out. Okay, and again, the oval window moves in and out when the ossicles are moved by the tympanic membrane. So in other words, when sound results in oscillating the tympanic membrane, the oval window is pushed in and out, and then almost out of phase, the round window pops out and in, kind of to dissipate this pressure. Because the fluid movement within the cochlea is it's a bony compartment, so whenever any pressure is made, it has to be released, and that seems to be the main purpose of the round window. So this promontory is this prominence created by the first turn of the cochlea, and it's what separates the oval and the round window. As I said, the seventh cranial nerve, the facial nerve, traverses at the superior part of this medial wall. And those are important landmarks, especially for surgeons who are trying to do surgical procedures within the middle ear or within the inner ear, such as when they're putting a prosthesis for a stapedectomy or when they are inserting the electrodes for a cochlear implant. So these are important landmarks that needs to be considered when doing those procedures. So here's an illustration again with the anterior wall being removed. So you can see the tympanic membrane, the ossicles with the middle ear muscles. The larger of the middle ear muscles would be a tensor tympani that originates just above the opening of the eustachian tube. And then in the other wall, opposite wall, the posterior wall, you've got the stapedius muscle, as you can see, that inserts into the stapes. And the stapedius muscle actually has an important function that we're going to be talking about when we talk about the acoustical reflexes. An important landmark in the anterior wall would be important structure, anatomical structure would be your eustachian tube or the auditory tube. It's a channel that connects the middle ear cavity to the nasopharynx, the upper portion of your oropharynx. It's about 3.5 centimeters in length, and it's oriented such that it moves downwards, forward, and medialwards. In other words, it moves from the ears to the nose in both sides. It's got two parts, the eustachian tube. The part that's close towards the middle ear is osseous or bony. And then the part that's towards the nasopharynx is made up of a cartilage, and that's the one that's pliable. So it has sphincters that it can close the eustachian tube. The diameter of the eustachian tube is not uniform, so it's almost like funnel shaped in both sides, while there's a narrower part in between, which we call as the isthmus. In adults, the eustachian tube is normally kept closed by an action of 3 sets of muscles from the nasopharynx. One of those muscles is this tensor veli palatini, which is also an important muscle for the soft palate. And these muscles contract and open up the eustachian tube when one is yawning, sneezing, or when you're swallowing, or when there's excessive pressure on either side from the nasopharynx or in the middle ear. There's a difference between the eustachian tube that you see in infants, especially younger than 6 months, and those in adults. In infants, the eustachian tube, for one, is less inclined. It's more straight, than what you see in adults. And also the muscles that are in the nasopharyngeal end of the eustachian tube are not completely developed, so it remains mostly open. And that's got important clinical significance. Um, and um, and it's the reason why mothers are advised to hold and feed their child in an inclined position, because there's more chances of any fluid or milk, in this case, entering into the middle ear cavity because the eustachian tube is not completely developed. And that's also one of the reasons why these infants are more prone to middle ear infections because of like bacteria easily entering into the middle ear cavity till the eustachian tube develops and matures. And the eustachian tube plays an important role towards the middle ear functioning, optimal middle ear functioning. So for the middle ear to function optimally, you need a mobile or very efficient tympanic membrane that's sensitive to even small pressure fluctuations created by sound. So for that to happen, the air pressure on both sides of the middle ear, well, both sides of the tympanic membrane, must be equal. In other words, the pressure in the middle ear space needs to be the same as the pressure in the atmosphere or the pressure within the external ear. Okay. If there is a difference between the pressure on the both sides of the tympanic membrane, so in this case the medial side of the tympanic membrane is where the middle ear is, and the lateral side of the tympanic membrane is the external ear, this difference in pressure is going to stiffen the tympanic membrane, um, thereby reducing the efficiency in which sound is transmitted inside and into the middle ear. So if the middle ear pressure is less than that of the external environment, in other words, if you have a negative middle ear pressure, the eardrum or the tympanic membrane is going to be kind of sucked medialwards or in. On the other hand, if you have a positive middle ear pressure, in other words, if the middle ear pressure is higher than the external environment's pressure, then the tympanic membrane is going to be kind of bulging out or more lateral. In either situation, the tympanic membrane's mobility is going to be restricted, reduced, thereby reducing the efficiency of sound traveling inwards. So this is where the eustachian tube comes into play. The main role of the eustachian tube is to kind of equating the pressure on both sides of the tympanic membrane, and it does so by periodically opening up the eustachian tube um, and letting air in, or in some cases out. So the eustachian tube is responsible for optimizing this middle ear function by ventilating the middle ear cavity. So, so its main function again is ventilation, or equilibrating air pressure uh, of the middle ear the same as that or as close as possible to that of the external environment or that pressure in the external ear. Okay. Even within a normal middle ear system, what happens is the middle ear tissues, which are mucus lined, continuously absorb air. So if not for the eustachian tube, you actually might develop a negative middle ear pressure. Um, so the eustachian tube needs to periodically open to kind of equate the pressure on both sides of the tympanic membrane. Okay, and one can do that manually also by this Valsalva's maneuver, where we pinch and blow up our cheeks, pinch our nose and blow up our cheeks, trying to push air, open the eustachian tube and push air into the middle ear. Another function of this eustachian tube is periodically draining this middle ear secretions into the nasopharynx. Okay. Um, so it moves fluid from the middle ear outside into the nasopharynx, On the other direction, it also protects the middle ear from potentially infectious organisms that can travel from the nasopharynx upwards uh, to the middle ear space. So that's why it's periodically, um, it's closed in adults, preventing these infections entering